And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Rivera from Miami for 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. Very nice to see you again after spending some time together in Cartagena. In terms of my opening statement, I just want to give you some of my reflections based on our trip to participate and observe the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena, Colombia. And one of the biggest concerns that I took away from that summit was this notion that I believe President Santos had introduced maybe weeks or months earlier when the issue of Cuba's integration into the summit process came up. President Santos talked about perhaps the need to redefine our definition of democracy, because as we know, one of the premises of the summit process is, of course, participation of democratic nations. And I think it's a very dangerous, slippery slope that we get into if presidents start talking about redefining democracy, because I think there are a lot of tyrants around the world, and certainly in Latin America, or prospective tyrants, that could seek refuge in the notion that we somehow need to redefine democracy just to make an accommodation or to apologize for a communist totalitarian dictatorship in Cuba. So I want to explore that a little more in my question and answer session, but I certainly want you to know that I hope this administration will summarily reject the notion that democracy needs to be redefined somehow in order so that we can accommodate tyrants like the Castro brothers, because all that will do is encourage further anti-democratic behavior in the hemisphere. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd now like to recognize Mr. Rivera for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to raise the specter of the recent visit between President Obama and Mr. Medvedev, Putin's puppet in Russia, in which President Obama expressed flexibility, or a willingness to be more flexible with respect to U.S.-Russian relations after the upcoming election. And Mr. Medvedev's response that he will, of course, inform his master, Putin, of the president's willingness for flexibility. Because in essence, what the president was signaling to our allies, like Poland, a great ally, that we are willing to throw them under a bus on an issue like missile defense and risk our own security as well once the nuisance of an election is behind President Obama. I think that was an extraordinary message to be sending to our allies, and a very dangerous message to be sending to our foes. I know that in Cartagena after the summit, there was a lack of consensus, as you just cited, regarding a statement inviting Cuba to participate in the next summit, and I know some of our diplomats saw that as some sort of a victory, and that thus maybe we should tone down expressing our concerns on this matter, because of course that's what diplomats do. They don't want to make waves. But I believe President Obama's colloquy with Medvedev gives me grave concerns on a host of foreign policy and national security issues. So let me just ask you specifically and directly. Did President Obama or any member of this administration communicate to representatives of any government any private assurances of flexibility after this election with respect to Cuba's admission into the summit process?
Congressman, we did not.
Thank you. Let me ask you another question very directly. If President Obama is reelected, and assuming you continue in your post, which I hope you will, and assuming Cuba remains the totalitarian dictatorship that exists today, when that summit comes up again in Panama, will the United States attend the next summit in Panama if Cuba participates?
I have to say, Congressman, there's so many hypotheticals in there.
There's only two.
Well-
President Obama being reelected and Cuba being a totalitarian communist dictatorship that is on the list of terrorist sponsors by your State Department, that your State Department has issued. You have placed Cuba on the list of terrorist sponsors. If those conditions exist at the next summit in Panama, will the United States participate if Cuba participates?
Congressman, I can't say definitively what status Cuba will have 3 years hence. Hang on one
Today's
second.
status.
But if nothing changes, then neither would our position.
So if nothing changes in Cuba with respect to their governing structure, and there is an effort to include Cuba, and indeed that effort succeeds and comes to fruition, the United States will not participate in the Summit of the Americas in Panama. Is that correct?
What I can't do here is make you a promise on behalf of the President. I can't speak for a future action by the President. But what I can tell you is nothing will have changed in our view that Cuba should not be part of the summit process until they are a democracy and have made changes. If those changes have not come, we will not believe they should be part of the summit process. And we will have to confront that at the time that the summit is being planned.
Well, I hope.
It might include lots of different
Well,
options.
I hope you will. I hope a very clear signal will be sent by whatever administration is in power in the White House after these elections, that under no circumstances will the United States provide credibility, legitimacy, credence to a supposedly democratic process when such an anti-democratic regime like the Castro dictatorship would be participating. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sears. Mr. Rivera, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, it has been the policy of this administration since it was inaugurated vis-a-vis U.S.-Cuba relations to loosen travel and trade regulations and sanctions on the Castro dictatorship. The result of that policy, which I often refer to as unilateral concessions to the dictatorship, have been well documented. A wave of repression across the island. Cuba continues to harbor fugitives from U.S. justice, including cop killers and drug traffickers. Cuba continues to be on the State Department list of sponsors of terrorism, even going to the extent of taking and holding a United States citizen, Alan Gross, hostage in Cuba with an expressed willingness, as Bill Richardson's trip to Havana demonstrates, an expressed willingness to try to trade that hostage to the United States. Is there anything else the Castro dictatorship could do that would actually trigger this administration to tighten sanctions?
Well, Congressman, let me start off by saying that the people-to-people programs, the regulatory changes to allow purposeful travel to Cuba are not designed as anything that benefits the regime. They're designed to benefit the Cuban people. They're designed to allow more contact outside of government for Cuban citizens and American citizens in particular areas. And so we don't see those as positive for the government of Cuba, but for the people of Cuba. We have kept all of the embargo provisions in place. As you know, those are by law. Those are not ones that could change in regulation. And there's no plan to change those at this point. We've also engaged with the Cuban government only on issues, frankly, that are in our national interest, that are in our national security interest, when it is critical to our interests to do so. So we believe that we've kept a very firm line on sanctions with the Cuban government, but tried to open up space for average Cubans separate from their government.
Can you cite any progress in democratic reforms on the island that have resulted from that policy?
Congressman, I can't give you specific examples yet of areas in which citizens have yet been able to exercise more freely political rights. I wish I could, but I do believe, and I'm sure that you would agree, that American citizens are often the best ambassadors for our country. And I do think that increased contact helps bring us closer to the
Well, of course, that contact did not begin with this administration. We've always had travel, family unification, and other types of licensed travel to Cuba, and it hasn't resulted in any democratic reforms. But let me just go, I only have a minute left, to Venezuela very quickly, because my understanding is that in January of this year, you were sent documents from the Venezuelan Ministry of Justice implicating Hugo Chavez in covering up a case involving a 2.2-ton shipment of cocaine in November of 2005, and that according to these materials, President Chavez was notified in writing of, quote, sufficient evidence linking then Brigadier General Henry de Jesus Rangel Silva in the smuggling case, and that rather than ordering an inquiry into this denunciation of Rangel Silva's involvement in narcotics trafficking, Chavez has actually named him his Minister of Defense. And I'm wondering what action, if any, was taken to expose this apparent criminality.
Congressman, all I can say on that is that when we receive information about potential wrongdoing, allegations of wrongdoing in Venezuela, as in every other country, we make sure that we pass those documents to the relevant U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies and continue to look at those very carefully for potential future actions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sears. Now I recognize Mr. Rivera for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much. I'm pleasantly surprised that we get another round. I didn't know we would, but so maybe I'll ask about Cuba. And something very interesting happened in the summit. And, again, just want you to kind of have a free association moment here. But Congressman Cedars and Congressman Mack and Congressman Engel and I, we were in some meetings where I remember some of us asked presidents of Latin American countries, why is it that there's this push to integrate Cuba into the summit process so vehemently among some presidents? And we actually had presidents tell us, in a moment of candor, that the main reason is because many Latin American countries fear upheaval and civil unrest among the more leftist sectors of their society, labor groups, student groups, non-government organizations that are very sympathetic and have alignment and nexus with the Castro dictatorship. And so in order to prevent those types of disturbances and civil unrest, they kowtow to the Castro brothers. We actually heard that from Latin American presidents. President Calderon from Mexico was here yesterday. We met with him, and I asked him what he could cite as the success of over 50 years of engagement by Latin America in Cuba, what democratic reforms they can cite, because they always call our policy a failure. So I asked him for the successes in terms of democratic reforms of engagement in Cuba by Mexico and other Latin American countries. And his response was, well, we were able to extract Mexican citizens from Cuba's prisons. And again, he stated how Cuba had these relationships with terrorist organizations like the FARC, but they never had terrorist problems in Mexico precisely because of their friendly relationship with the Castro brothers. And so you have so much experience in Latin America, and I'm just going to ask you to, whatever candor you can give here within the parameters of being a diplomat and a representative of the U.S. government, does any of this ring true to you?
I guess the part that rings true is that all politicians have different constituencies to engage with. But I also think the president said it really well when he talked about moving beyond left and right. And there are universal standards that we in this hemisphere have signed up to. And I think some of those old debates about, the left and the right domestically in countries throughout the hemisphere are just not as relevant as they used to be.
So you don't believe that Latin American leaders fear the connections between the Castro brothers and leftist elements, whether it be terrorist elements or civil elements in their societies, and therefore that's why they seem to be so compliant towards the Castro dictatorship?
I think it's very hard for me to assert what they may feel or have.
I'm asking just based on your experience as a
No,
diplomat
I
throughout Latin
appreciate
America.
that. I really do. I appreciate that, and I appreciate your confidence that I can ascertain sort of the reasons behind this. But I certainly think, as I said, I guess in the start, they all have constituencies. So there may be some element of political evaluation that this is an issue on which the left cares deeply, and they may want to address that particular constituency.
Well, I appreciate that. I've got 1 minute left, and I'd like to ask you with respect to Millennium Challenge funds and in Central America, particularly in El Salvador. We've seen what's been happening with El Salvador and confiscation of U.S. Investments in El Salvador and so forth, and in other countries in Central America. Do you think it's time for perhaps the United States to reassess our relationship in terms of these programs with these countries that are having, I guess, offensive behavior, really, towards U.S. interests in these countries?
Congressman, I think it's very important that we pursue issues of potential expropriation or takings of properties with governments, whether it's El Salvador or others in the hemisphere, and we're going to do that pretty aggressively. But I don't think we have come to the conclusion that it would necessarily be productive to end relationships through the MCC or other of our assistance programs, which go to some of the poorest in those countries, and we continue to believe are very important programs. That doesn't mean we're not going to work on the issues of potential takings or expropriations.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. And